Welcome to Teacher Rants and Red Pill Readings, episode number 3. The rant is now in session. And today we're going to talk about the idea of a moral presidency and how Americans' views of that have evolved over time from the early republic until now. And really the big topic with this, or the big catalyst for change, has been Donald Trump. And what I'm going to do is explore that a little bit and how we've gone from George Washington to Trump and what that's looked like from a moral lens, so to speak, and how that came to be when it really first changed. And then, of course, I'm going to wrap up with another really good recommendation, especially as far as how presidents are ranked. And I think you find the recommendation is truly groundbreaking in the criteria that are used, right? So with Donald Trump, the things that have really stood out primarily is not just that we've elected a reality star not once but twice, but when Trump won in 2016, I remember, and of course I want to tie this into my classroom experiences as well because it's been a challenging act to say the least, but when Trump won in 2016, I remember being in a graduate class that summer, and we were looking at primaries and things like that, and I forget how many people there were at the time that Trump was debating and that were involved in the conversation for the Republican Party. But it was obvious right away that Trump was an outlier. Stalwarts of the party did not like him. He was not accepted as one of their own. And this was really patently clear from the beginning. But we were in a graduate course, and my fellow students and I, we were posing questions to the professor, and we really were just curious as to whether or not this guy thought that Trump had staying power. And I'll say that this particular professor is a pretty renowned scholar in the area of the early republic. He's a famous Jeffersonian scholar. And we asked him, well, hey, will Trump stick around? Is this going to last? Is it a fad? And this particular professor's opinion was that, no, Trump's a cartoon. I think that was the word he actually used. Trump's a cartoon. The novelty will wear off. People will tire of him. And, of course, the real candidates will weed him out and they'll take over. And obviously we know now that wasn't the case. And there are many factors that played into that we don't have time to get into here. But Trump's honesty, his boorishness, his outsider appeal, even as a billionaire, his ability to connect with the little people, which love him or hate him, he's been able to do that, obviously prove he had staying power. But what I noticed right away, and of course many people notice this, is that journalism completely evolved almost overnight with Trump's victory. And we're talking mainstream media, we're talking newspaper outlets, cable news, and of course, really when he took over, podcasts were already around, but social media was evolving too. And so there came to be many more outlets that were looking at his presidency, and of course, the pros and cons of that. But my larger point here is that the focal point became not just Trump's bull in a china shop demeanor, but how he supposedly represented a great dramatic break in what the office represented and what it stood for. And what people meant when they said this and when they wrote this is that up to that point in the 21st century, there had been this implicit understanding, supposedly, that Americans were trying to elect good people, good men of character, men of integrity, men of moral fiber. And obviously that wasn't always the case, but Trump seemed so reckless and so openly crass and kind of like a bully and so misogynistic that it just was not acceptable. And he was deemed by many outlets as quote-unquote unfit for office. Obviously he was impeached not once but twice. And so journalists openly came out and said, and I remember Matt Taibbi, it was a really prominent journalist, came out and pointed to articles that were published in places like the New York Times, Washington Post, where writers came out and said essentially that, look, the old standards of journalism, thanks to Trump, are now gone. And we can no longer abide by this sort of attempted objectivity because Trump is so bad and he represents such an existential threat to freedom and democracy and what the office meant that we now have to go on the attack. And you really saw this going after really like 2017 and beyond, right? So he took office in 2017, and going into the 2020 election, outlets openly said, more or less. And it's all come out now. The Twitter files exposed so much of this, by the way. But outlets essentially came out and said, look, we can't have happen what happened with Hillary. So because they treated Hillary and Trump both relatively fairly in their attacks on them, that enabled Trump to win. And so really what Trump's victory did, and we're seeing this now in the Trump era. And by the way, I think that going forward, when historians write their histories on the last 2 decades, it really is the age of Trump. Much like if you go back and study the 1820s, 1830s, historians label it the age of Jackson, or you can look at the New Deal era, or, on and on it goes. But Trump has put such a signature on the last decade thereabouts that it has altered so much of the way we view political discourse and the way that we view the left-right paradigm and the way each side, left and right, and the parties, I guess, Democrats, Republicans, view themselves, that it's changed everything. And I'm not saying it won't go back, or some of it won't go back to at least some of the ways that they were, but it's indelibly shaped political discourse, and especially as far as morality in the presidency. And just like I said before, with journalists coming out and saying he's so bad, there are many that I could point to. I mean, guys like Michael Tracy, Glenn Greenwald, Matt Taibbi, I would argue have stayed pretty consistent. Aaron Mate is another one, Chris Hedges. These guys, none of them liked Trump. All of them openly opposed him and probably voted for his opponent in both those elections. But they, at least the last 4 or 5 years, have tried to maintain, I would argue, a fairly impartial view towards politicians, towards leaders. And so a lot of them were crucified by the so-called left because of that. And this idea of morality in the presidency, it's a huge issue in American political historiography. Because what has happened in my lifetime? So, growing up as a Gen Xer, I grew up in the 70s, so I had the shadow of, Vietnam and Nixon. That was kind of my in the background of me growing up, and my family as a blue collar family. We didn't talk a lot about politics, but that was sort of in the background, right? And it was always kind of understood as I got into my teen years that if you were on the left, if you were a Democrat, you opposed, quote unquote, the system, the establishment. And this meant, to a large degree, that you were opposed to actors for state power. And it's not, you can't broad brush paint necessarily, but in general, this really was the understanding, right? If you were on the left, and just kind of picture all the 1960s craziness, picture the mid to late 60s, picture 1969 in Woodstock, and picture burning draft cards, and picture protests on campus, and picture some of the really bizarre, crazy, volatile situations that culminated really kind of in the 68 Democratic Convention in Chicago. My point, though, is that you would have never seen prominent voices for the left supporting the CIA, supporting the FBI, supporting, legacy media's kind of trite narratives about who's in power, who deserves power. It was always built in. Questioning was always built into that side, that side of the paradigm, right? And Trump has changed that. It is really bizarre to me, when we were going into 2020 in the election, and then I guess shortly after Biden won, when you'd see guys like Jon Stewart, Bill Maher, not that these are famous intellectuals or anything, but they're pretty prominent voices on the left. You'd see them interviewing guys who had been CIA actors, guys who had supported the war on terror, guys who had supported Bush's and Obama's use of torture. And you'd see them interviewing guys and lauding them as heroes because Trump was so bad, they found it necessary to support whoever opposed him, right? And this is what we've called TDS, or Trump Derangement Syndrome, which I think now it's so overused that it's almost passé. But that is what Trump has done. And this goes directly to him being perceived as unfit for office. And if you go back throughout American history, Trump's kind of crude populist appeal is not new. When Trump talked about making America great again or draining the swamp, a lot of it was kind of Andrew Jackson 2.0. When Jackson took office in 1829, for example, there's the infamous example of the inaugural ceremony where his followers essentially bum rush. They come in, they're invited into the White House, They tear up drapes, they get stuff on the floor, they knock over punch bowls. Jackson has to kind of duck out of there. It's so chaotic. And elites looked on and just aghast. They were just shocked, right? And Jefferson had passed away a few years prior to this, and he had warned people about Jackson's rough, violent demeanor. And so here we are in 1829, and that's what had happened, right? So that really, Jackson was the first president who was a big break from the elites dominating the office. And that's one of the first times we see the American people, as we come to know them as a voting mass, come look at the American presidency as, well, it should indicate virtue. It should indicate, this kind of decorum and protocol, going back to the great George Washington, right? And I think people knew that wasn't going to be the case necessarily because people aren't perfect. But Jackson was such a dramatic break in that sense that sort of opened the door to subsequently looking at a president's morals, like examine him with more scrutiny. And of course, the media played into that as well, as media evolved over the subsequent decades and going into the late 19th, early 20th century. And you really see this become more pronounced with the advent of the Cold War. And when you go to the Cold War, right after World War II, right, so we're looking at 1948, you see the first Arthur Schlesinger presidential rankings. And Lincoln was at the top. And we've talked about Lincoln and how problematic Lincoln's presidency is, and I'm going to come back to that theme as I go into future episodes. But when you look at presidential rankings initially in the Cold War era, it's then looked at as it's not about the person necessarily, it's about the cause, right? So the cause became the Cold War, the holy Cold War against evil atheistic communism. And so you could put guys like Lincoln in there or FDR. Washington was kind of an outlier because Washington was always perceived as so noble and almost above the fray. I mean, to a degree, that he kind of had a special top standing either way, or a unique top standing. But whether it's Lincoln or Truman or FDR, those guys were all Machiavellian in their practices. And it was known then. It wasn't like it was hidden in 1948. But fast forward to 1962, when Schlesinger did the rankings again, it was the same top two, right, with Lincoln at the top and Washington number 2. And so when you look at these guys, they were more about, their rankings were more based on how holy the Cold War crusade was, right? Well, with Trump, fast forwarding to the 21st century, Trump's stature, the way he's viewed, it's such a break that now I don't know if there's any going back. And I think that Trump is more of a symptom than a cause. And it's really bizarre to me because, just to put it bluntly, I would argue that it's selective morality. And I've got into several discussions with this. And it's one of those areas in a classroom, as I bring my ranting to my students, it's one of the areas that's really challenging because I want students to form their own opinions, but I want them to be opinions that are based on fact and not veneer or dog and pony show, right? So, for example, one of the moments that really made Trump, it really actually made his popularity grow, is when he challenged the legitimacy of the Iraq War. And in fact, he called it a lie. And I believe at the time he was in a red state. I want to say it was South Carolina. And it actually made him more popular. And people were kind of shocked at the time. But if you look at what Trump did, right? If you look at it's a crass tweet, or it's him kind of mocking somebody, or being just really brusque and kind of alpha in his aggressiveness. Yeah, those might be bad things, negative things. But if you contrast that or juxtapose that with what Bush and Obama did, just for starters, and we could go through a whole litany of lists of things presidents have done prior to those two guys. And I want to be delicate when I say this, but if you look at Bush and Obama, multiple wars, sanctioning of torture, which America had allegedly never really stood for. At least Americans wanted to believe we didn't stand for that as a nation. So sanctioning of torture, drone strikes, authorization to use drones on American citizens, selling wars based on lies. I mean, literally hiring PR agencies to sell wars and then connecting guys like Saddam Hussein to bin Laden, making those connections even though those connections weren't in fact there. So take those god-awful things and then look at a guy like Trump, and yes, crude, crass, inappropriate, a guy I wouldn't want my daughters to look towards as a kind of male role model, right? As somebody who I think protects feminine virtue. But which is worse morally? I had students come into my classroom years ago, and this was, I think Trump was in his first year of his first term, so it was 2017, I guess. And students were coming in, and I think they were kind of parroting what their parents were saying about Trump and how bad he was, and they were saying some kind of vulgar things based on what they were kind of repeating Trump's vulgar comments. And I had read an article about Trump and Lincoln, Trump versus Lincoln. And the article essentially was making the claims that in many ways what Lincoln had done was worse. And these students were just livid about that. They thought that was ridiculous. But when you really look at the actions of these presidents and what they did, the Civil War killed, they're estimating now, about 1 million people, 1 million deaths. And it's not all Lincoln per se, but it was Lincoln who invaded the South. So if I compare and contrast that with Trump, who, yes, not an ideal role model by any stretch of the imagination, but Trump didn't really start any new wars. Now, he didn't de-escalate many things either, but you have to really weigh this out. And we're looking at facts versus rhetoric versus window dressing. And I've told my students repeatedly about, and we talked about intellectual consistency, and that's really what we should be looking at, right? And so when you get into morality, it's kind of abstract and it's challenging. And I think that a lot of people have, well, I guess the never-Trumpers especially, but the election in a way repudiates some of what the left's claims had been, but that notwithstanding, I think a lot of people get so caught up in what they wanted the president to be, what the presidency to be, and it is disconcerting, right, when that curtain is pulled back and you see what the system really is. And I'll be honest in saying that I obviously am never going to be one to condone a lot of Trump's crasser actions, but in a way I was grateful for his first term because it stripped away so much of the veneer of what people have thought about governments and about our deep state itself. And to kind of see it pulled back and to kind of see it in all of its kind of raw use of power was kind of it's enlightening. And truth is disconcerting sometimes. It's disorienting. But I'd much rather know exactly what's going on rather than have this kind of idealistic vision. Excuse me. Idealistic vision of what the presidency is. And so I'd much rather know the truth about things, right? And so I came across years ago, though, a really great way to measure the effectiveness of presidents. And it's a book written by Ivan Eland. And Eland worked with some economists or used some economic data on this too. And the book is called Recarving Rushmore. And Ivan Eland is a scholar who works he's associated with the Independent Institute. And he specializes in diplomatic relations. And he's written some really interesting books. And what I like about Ivan Eland's work is that he does a deep dive into actual data, right? So again, growing up, for me, it was always, as much as I was apolitical, I heard a lot about how great Ronald Reagan was. And again, I've likened him, he's essentially the Republican Jesus, right? He's this figure that Republicans after kind of had to look to as a model. And when you look, though, at numbers and what he actually did, point of fact is that Jimmy Carter deregulated more than Ronald Reagan did. Jimmy Carter was better on monetary policy, for example. Now, it's tricky because Carter had one term and Reagan had two. But what I like about Eland's work is that he examines things like that. He looks at, here's the rhetoric versus, okay, here's the reality. And he's, in many ways, he's a numbers guy. And so in his book, 11 Presidents, for example, he really looks at guys like Eisenhower, Carter, Reagan, etc. And the book I just mentioned, Recarving Rushmore, he has a very simple three-pronged metric by which to measure presidents, and it's peace, prosperity, liberty. And the rankings really just flip the traditional rankings on their head. The guys who normally are celebrated as great heroes of the presidency, right? Guys like Lincoln or FDR or Truman or Woodrow Wilson wind up at the bottom, because if you look at peace, prosperity, liberty, what Eland's looking at, when Eland, again, in conjunction with looking at economic data, especially by two pretty prominent economists, it's Vedder and Galloway, and I'll mention them again at some point in the future. But what you're looking at is peace, how a president goes to great lengths to keep the country out of war if possible. do you keep America on a peacetime footing if possible, right? And then prosperity, how was the economy during the time the president was in office? In other words, did his policies contribute to economic growth, economic stability, or was there inflation, high unemployment? Was there a lot of regulation that hindered, capital investment, things like that? And then liberty, how did this president handle civil liberties? Were his policies ones that actually allowed for individual freedoms? And each one of those categories, by the way, has specifics as to what, how we measure those things. But if you look at just peace, prosperity, liberty, what Elam does is he takes the rankings, and they're very different from what you'd expect and what had been the case before, right? For example, he's got guys like John Tyler and Martin Van Buren near the top. Guys like Harding and Coolidge fare a lot better than they had previously. Guys like Grover Cleveland. Because when you're looking at what they actually did and how they managed their time in office, they, for the most part, the guys I just mentioned, had policies that were really they were inclined towards freedom, individual freedoms, and keeping the country out of wars, etc. And it's with Trump. Yeah, it's very different. The Trump era has seen so much change as far as journalism, as far as how we perceive the presidency. And I think that sadly we're now at the point where if those who were dead set against him anyway, dead set against what he represented, I think once that is fixed, and you're convinced that the presidency had always represented, vision XYZ, then that probably is not going to change for you. Whereas if you're somebody who kind of liked you found an appeal to maybe the way he approached regular people or the way that he won them over, then probably those people are also kind of fixed in that. What obviously we want to be objective as we can be. And so we have to kind of take a step back, which is really hard to do, by the way, of course, because we live in a world where we are incessantly bombarded with media images and memes and videos. And of course, there are biases in all those things, right? But I think recarving Rushmore is a really great antidote to a lot of that, the hysteria, the hoopla, the nasty rhetoric, because again, it's not that we all have time to do deep dives into all the numbers, and we can't fact check everything, but it really is good to take a fresh perspective on this. And I think it's good to, again, when you get red pilled about the presidency, it is really liberating, because I think that it's really disconcerting when we rehabilitate presidents that have done really heinous things. And look, as a person of grace, we want to give grace, we want to be merciful, compassionate, but we want to be fair too. And when we see guys who essentially might in other circumstances be labeled as war criminals being celebrated, when one guy is being really just vilified for something mean he said, I think that is selective morality. And I think that Recarving Rushmore is a great read. I think it forces us to re-examine the ways we view our leaders. And I think that you'll find it pretty eye-opening. So we'll see you next time.